Hi, my name's Rolf Olson. I'm the visitation pastor at Roseville Lutheran Church. I've been asked to address the issue of gun violence and what we might do about it. On October 25th, 2007, our 24-year-old daughter, Catherine, went to Savage. She went there to answer a Craigslist ad for a nanny. Catherine was a 2006 graduate of St. Olaf. She was Phi Beta Kappa, 3.9 GPA, Hispanic Studies and Theater major. She had some plans to become a Spanish professor someday, and she loved kids. And kids loved her, and so on occasion she would find short-term gigs as a nanny, sometimes as babysitter. That was something that paid her, and she enjoyed doing it and gave her joy. So on that Thursday morning, 2007, she drove out to Savage to meet two kids and a mother named Amy. Instead, she met a 19-year-old waiting for her with his father's pistol. Very quickly, in the entryway of the house, he shot her in the back, and he put her body in the trunk of her car and drove it off to a park, left it there, threw the keys in the swamp, and went to work. Well, the police found her body there about 36 hours later, and they arrested her murderer within hours. The truth is that he simply wanted to know what it felt like to kill someone, and Catherine was the unlucky recipient of his bullet. Now, the whole thing would make a pretty lame CSI episode, and I wish that's all it were. But it's true. And that young man was found guilty of first-degree premeditated murder. He was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole. He's going to die out in Bayport. It's the strongest punishment the state of Minnesota can hand out. Pretty sad story. Well, in 2015, I was approached by Protect Minnesota, and I've been involved in gun violence prevention work ever since. And I wear a variety of t-shirts. You may have seen these around. Protect Minnesota. Minnesotan against getting shot. I've worn this quite a bit. I also wear my survivor button, because I am one. Catherine, of course, is lost to gun violence. But I'm also a part of Moms Demand Action. You've heard of Moms Demand Action. They started after the Sandy Hook shootings, and now it's grown to be millions of people. Women and men. As the joke goes, men who are man enough to be moms. But I'm also a member of the Survivor Everytown Fellowship, Everytown Survivor Network, those who have lost loved ones to gun violence. I'm also a member of the Giffords organization, Minnesota Gun Owners for Safety, and that's who I am. I love this one because it says on the back, I'm pro-Second Amendment, I own guns, and I support common sense gun laws. That is my position. I wore this to the state fair last year when it was held. Met Congressman Phillips from out in the southwest part of the metro, and he and I talked about this. We had a great conversation. He liked my t-shirt. So I've got nothing against guns. I own two of them. I like hunting. But my mission is to reduce the carnage of gun violence. And as a police chaplain in Washington County for 17 years, I dealt with all sorts of suicides by gun. So I know gun violence and how it comes in various forms. So none of the legislation that I advocate now would have saved Catherine. That's true, I admit that. But the legislation that I advocate has been shown to save thousands of lives. So in this presentation, I'll review what that legislation is. I'm also going to share lots of statistics and numbers, so please bear with me. Without a chance for Q&A, I can't be sure that I will hit all your concerns, but I hope to address the majority of them. And at the end, I'll share my email address so you can communicate with me your comments, your questions, whatever might come up. And I invite you to do that. So as a pastor and as a Christian, I always try to think through how my faith informs my actions. And I hope you do that same thing. For me, the Roseville Lutheran Church mission statement works pretty much as well as anything. Our mission statement at Roseville Lutheran, love God, love your neighbor. It's a good mission statement. I think Jesus was right on. And frankly, he was quoting the Hebrew Scriptures when he gave us that challenge, that command, the two great commandments, which is our mission. But the next question we need to ask is, well, how do we do that? How do we live out our mission? Well, it's not hard to connect this with gun violence prevention. In Minnesota, 80% of completed suicides are by gun. And every year it's the same. 79%, 82%, 76%, 81%, always right around 80%. And most of them occur in rural Minnesota. There's lots of guns in rural Minnesota. All my farmer relatives had guns. Easy access to guns. But there are some other statistics that come into play here as well. Take a look at this one. 67% of gun owners cite personal protection as the primary reason they buy a gun. Of course, my farmer relatives, they use them for hunting. But most people who buy guns say they use them for protection. But look at the statistics here at the bottom. A gun in your home is 22 times more likely to injure or kill a family member than to be used in self-defense. Anyone living in a home with a gun is 3 times more likely to commit suicide. Women living in a home with a gun are 5 times more likely to be murdered by a domestic partner. So I'm persuaded guns are a problem. Loving God and loving neighbor must address the plague of guns that fills our society. With that said, I also affirm that the Second Amendment and gun violence prevention can go hand in hand. We can reduce the carnage of gun violence while supporting the Second Amendment. They are not mutually exclusive. So with that as kind of a background, let's get started on our conversation about gun violence prevention. You know, most people believe that the issue about guns and gun violence is all centered on the Second Amendment. Of course, that's the NRA position. That's the position of the gun lobby. But we've heard about Second Amendment sanctuaries. We've heard about Second Amendment this, Second Amendment that. But the truth is that argument about the Second Amendment is really a red herring. Because in 2008, in the Heller decision in Washington, D.C., which was about personal use of a handgun for self-protection, Justice Antonin Scalia wrote this. He said, like most rights, the right secured by the Second Amendment is not unlimited. We have the right to legislate who can have a gun, where guns can be carried, and which guns can be sold. So Protect Minnesota, and me included, we're not against the Second Amendment. We believe supporting the Second Amendment and reducing gun violence through legislation can be accomplished. So the approach that we take is public health approach rather than individual rights. Those who say the Second Amendment, the Second Amendment, the Second Amendment say individual rights and behavior and punishment, it's all about the individual. But if we take a public health model, we talk about public trends, population trends, and the safety of the community in aggregate. We put it all together and see how we can influence the safety for all. So let me give you an example of how this works. Here we have motor vehicle deaths. In 1946, there were 935 deaths per 100 million vehicle miles traveled. 9 people died per every 100 million miles traveled. And see what has happened since then, the trend in motor vehicle deaths. Seatbelts back in the 50s. 1974, 55 miles an hour. 1978, Tennessee required safety seats for children. 1983, car safety ratings were introduced. 1999, airbags. et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Continual decline in the number of car deaths per 100 million miles driven until 2016, just a little over 1 death per 100 million miles traveled. The point of this is, by using a public health perspective, we've reduced the deaths that have been experienced driving cars, and we haven't removed the right to drive cars. What we've done is instituted a number of different concerns to improve the safety of cars, and in the process, reduce the number of deaths. My point, if we can do it with cars, we can do it with guns. So let's look at the scope of the gun violence problem. In 2017, nearly 40,000 people died from gunshot wounds in America. More than 80,000 were shot, but they survived. So 1 American is shot every 5 minutes. Someone dies by gun every 14 minutes. Every day, 323 Americans are shot. 104 people die every day. Well, the statistics I showed you before talk about how a gun present increases the rate of death, the rate of violence, the rate of problems with women, with anyone living in a home, and with just accidental injury to people living there. Now, this is especially a problem these days in the pandemic, because this year, gun sales, as you well know, have gone off the charts. Without firearm safety training, without any experience in how to use a gun, the presence of guns in homes is a toxic combination. And we're seeing that this year with children shooting each other, with accidental shootings. It's all based on fear, of course, the fear of COVID, the fear of violence, the stress we're experiencing, economic, health, etc. And with guns, people have ready access to a violent means to respond to all the stresses. Guns are the second leading cause in America for all children and youth. Take a look at this. Gun deaths per 100,000 children and teens in high-income countries. United States, 3.24 gun deaths per 100,000 children and teens. Then we go to Canada, Finland, Israel, down here, Denmark, Norway, France, Sweden, Italy, Germany, way down here, United Kingdom. The number of gun deaths per 100,000 children for all children and youth, and it's the first leading cause of death for young African American males. Another one here. Women, 21 times more likely to be murdered with a gun in the U.S. than in any other high-income country. Per 100,000 female residents in the U.S., here's the ratio, 1.1. Here, every other high-income industrialized country, you see the rate of comparison. In states that require background checks, those that have to be accomplished before every handgun sale, 46% fewer women are shot to death by their domestic partners. Now, the percentages change, but these are the overall numbers. Again, public health perspective, just in aggregate, taking all the incidents and combining them to see some statistical patterns. Now, I talked with a Dakota County Sheriff Deputy the other day, and he challenged me on this. He said, I've gone to plenty of domestic violence situations. And he said, I've seen choking, I've seen punching, I've seen knives used. I've never seen a gun used. Good for him. Apparently in Dakota County, guns are not used as often in domestic situations as in others. But this is nationwide, the U.S., across the nation. We are the standout globally in the number of women who are shot in domestic violence situations. Of course, the pandemic makes things much more complicated. Some simple facts that have come out in 2020. 1 in 4 people have considered suicide during the pandemic. Our fractured society filled with fear of COVID and social unrest, that's led to the increased gun sales. In Minnesota, just in August of this year versus August of last year, 59% increase in gun sales. Through July of this year, there was a 50% increase in gunshots over the last year, 2019. The number of people shot in Minneapolis is up 47% in 1 year. So gun sales without gun safety training, it's a dangerous, toxic, volatile combination. How about the words of the New Testament from 1 John? There is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear. We certainly have fear in our society these days. Well, let's get closer to home. Let's talk about Minnesota a little bit. We have a gun violence problem. More than 3 people are shot every day in Minnesota. More than 1 person dies from injuries of being shot. In 2017, 465 people died from gunshots in Minnesota. Every year it's about the same, 450 to 500, right in there every year. Much more than 1 person per day dies by gun in Minnesota. And as I mentioned earlier, the majority of the gun deaths occur in rural areas. The farm crisis, economic stresses, all of that leads to a volatile combination with ready access to guns. Here in Minnesota, more people die from guns than from car accidents or opioids. Take a look at this. 358 Minnesotans died in car accidents. That was in 2017. 400 Minnesotans died from opioids. 465 died from firearms. We've passed laws on car accidents. We've passed laws on opioids. We refuse to do anything more about the gun danger in our society. Gun violence spans all the age groups in Minnesota. It affects all ages, and it especially affects the young. Take a look at the numbers here. Notice the chart. Here's the number of gun deaths from 0 up to 55, right there. And here's the age span. Age 0 to 4, 5 to 9, 10 to 14, etc. All the way down to age 90 plus. Okay? Let's talk about gun suicides right here. It's this line right here, the middle line. Gun suicides. Look where it spikes for younger people, age 19, 20, 21, 22, right in there. It also peaks here around age 55, 56. 57 suicides, and then diminishes, thankfully. Gun homicides, the lighter blue here. Like I said, 80% of gun deaths in Minnesota are by suicide. And as we can see here, youth suicide, young adult suicide is the greatest number. 1 Minnesotan dies by suicide every day. Minnesota gun suicides increased 65% 2000 to 2017. Now, we can save lives if we limit access to guns. It's a simple fact. If there's a suicide attempt with a gun, it's a greater than 85% chance of it being fatal. If you don't use a gun, knife, pills, hanging, whatever the other options are, less than 5% fatal. The means used to attempt suicide matters. We can save lives by reducing access to guns. So every minute that we can delay an act of suicide, we increase the likelihood that a life will go on for years to come. As the phrase goes, it's better to lose a friendship than to lose a friend to suicide. The first thing to do, if you learn a friend or family member is thinking about suicide, get guns away from them, because over 85% of suicide attempts by gun are completed. Less than 5% are without guns are fatal. That's the reason we are advocating extreme risk protection orders or red flag laws, to get those guns away from the people who are contemplating suicide. And if we can do that, we save their lives. Studies show that if a person is stopped from completing a suicide and they get treatment, rarely will they ever attempt suicide again. The number is in the single digits, 6%, 8% will attempt suicide a second time. So if we can stop that first time, especially if they're thinking of using a gun, we can literally save their lives for decades to come. Another position that Protect Minnesota advocates is safe storage of guns. Gun cabinets, gun vaults, locking those guns up. Now this would have made a difference in my daughter's death, because the murderer took his father's pistol out of his dresser drawer, and he had bullets in his pill bottle right next to the gun. So the son just took those bullets and loaded them, and that was the end of my daughter. Protect Minnesota gives away thousands of these trigger locks every year. They fit inside the case around the trigger of the gun, slides in there, and then with the key you can lock it so you can't pull the trigger. It's just inserted in there and take the key out and keep it in a hidden place, and that gun can only be used as a club or a doorstop or something, because it is non-functional if you can't pull the trigger. Protect Minnesota is about gun safety, lowering gun violence and gun deaths. Trigger locks is one way that we make that happen, and we provide those to people free of charge. Donations to Protect Minnesota are used to buy trigger locks. Okay, one issue that always comes up when dealing with gun violence, and we hear it, it's really a mental health problem. It's not a gun problem. That's really not true. Mental illness is a factor in gun violence 4% of the time. Diagnosable mental health issues, mental illness, 4% of the time when involved in gun violence. However, guns are a factor in gun violence 100% of the time. Guns are the issue. Mental illness is certainly a factor in suicide, and we want to address that and acknowledge that. But the issue is the presence of guns. And that's why these extreme risk protection orders, which I'll get into in a minute, red flag laws, are so important. But just a factor to remember here when we hear this issue of mental illness is the factor in gun violence. A person with mental illness is more likely to be a victim of gun violence rather than being a perpetrator of gun violence. It's a racial issue too. Gun violence impacts blacks and whites differently. Suicide and homicide. In the black community, 15% roughly suicides, and probably 80% homicide. In the white community, suicide 80%, as we mentioned, and maybe 16-17% homicide. Black men are 14 times more likely to be shot and killed than white men. We've seen in the COVID situation, there is a disproportionate effect of COVID on the poorer and the blacker communities. the stresses there are significant. And with access to guns, they're often played out with the shootings. Now, here's something to address as well. Urban gun violence. You know, we often hear talk about, well, we need to do something about North Minneapolis. That's where all the gun violence is. Well, no, actually in Minnesota, most of the gun violence is out in greater Minnesota, as we've talked about. It's suicide. Most Minnesota urban violence is in 2 zip codes, 55412, 55411, and then especially in 2 neighborhoods within those 2 zip codes. Now, an observation by a Minneapolis North Side leader, former Minneapolis city councilman, he says from his perspective, 12 extended families commit 90% of the gun violence. So the solution is not to police everywhere in the community, everywhere in North Minneapolis, everywhere in the big cities, etc., but to focus more targeting our policing and targeting our corrective actions on trauma and healing rather than criminalization, and focusing on interventions that focus on the way we can deal with the trauma and the healing in those neighborhoods rather than just mass criminalization and policing and clamping down on everybody. And of course, we know about Philando Castile. African Americans are killed by police at a rate 3 times greater than whites. One thing about Protect Minnesota is they've established an office in North Minneapolis. They know that there is a concern and an issue in dealing with gun violence there. And Iolanda Evans, right here, is the office manager and the outreach person for Protect Minnesota in North Minneapolis. And here's just some of the people involved. Okay, so let's turn and ask the question, what can we do? What can we do about gun violence? Well, one thing I've already advocated is that stronger gun laws equal fewer deaths. Here's a chart that shows the states, the United States. And here's the rate of gun deaths per 100,000 population. 0, here's 20 gun deaths per 100,000 population. And we see 22 states are up at about 17 gun deaths per 100,000. The 7 states with the strictest gun laws have the fewest gun deaths. And then it goes, less gun laws, less, and very few gun laws. So what states do you think would be over on the left? Just take a look at that. What do you think? Where do you think Minnesota falls in this span? Are we an A, a B, a C, a D? Here we go. 7 states. The 7 states with the strictest gun laws and the fewest gun deaths are Hawaii, Connecticut, New York, Massachusetts, California, New Jersey, and Maryland. You see where Minnesota falls. You see Connecticut is over here. In the early 2000s, Connecticut imposed universal background checks on all gun sales. I'll talk about universal background checks in a minute. But when they said all gun sales needed to have a background check on the purchaser, their homicide rate dropped by 15%. About the same time, Missouri removed the law that said all gun sales had to have a background check. Their homicide and suicide rate went up 17%. Now, do laws work? They certainly do. In 1936, the National Firearms Act, that's when machine guns were outlawed, where you just pull the trigger and it goes like that. Silencers were eliminated in 1936. Sawed-off shotguns were eliminated. Their use in crime plummeted. Deaths were spared. In 1994, the federal assault weapons ban, that'd be things like the AR-15, you know, you've seen these, the assault weapons. When that was imposed in 1994, large group shootings, you know, the mass shootings that we've been so shocked by, school shootings, etc., dropped significantly. That ban was eliminated in 2004, and these massacre-type shootings went up significantly. Child access prevention laws. That's laws that say all guns need to be locked up with trigger lock or in a gun vault or gun safe. Child access prevention laws, they have been shown to reduce gun deaths, certainly in children. And in Minnesota, if you're caught leaving a firearm accessible to a child, if the child dies or is injured, that's a crime, and you'll be prosecuted for that. So most effective of all the laws, and these are the two that protect Minnesota, Moms Demand Action, Giffords, we're all pushing right now, are these two right here: criminal background checks and permit and extreme risk protection orders. Now, some facts again. I hope I'm not blurring you with statistics, but here's some facts. 1 in 5, 22% of all gun sales don't involve a background check. Unlicensed dealers who are not licensed by the federal government, don't need to do background checks. Now, some do, but many of them don't, and they don't have to. And this is what's called the gun show loophole, where people can buy guns from an unlicensed dealer at a gun show, and they don't have to have a background check. And it is also true that criminals seek out unlicensed dealers for their guns for the guns that they plan to use in crimes, because there's no background check. People don't know that they have a gun, and then when you use it in a crime, there's the police don't know just where to go with that person. Well, let's take a look a little more specifically. In February 2020, the Minnesota House passed Minnesota Background Check Bill HF 8. And that requires background checks for the private transfer, the sale to an individual of pistols and semi-automatic military-style weapons. This is the AR-15, you know, the military-style weapons that we see. Interesting, shotguns and long rifles, guns, hunting rifles, they are exempt. So they are not included in this law. And the way this works, permit to purchase. Say I want to buy a pistol. I have to go to the Roseville Police Department or to the Ramsey County Sheriff's Department and fill out an application. I can do that online, of course. But they do a background check, and then I have to go and pick up that permit, which then for 1 year gives me the legal right to go buy a gun at Cabela's or at Joe's Sporting Goods or at some gun shop. Permit to purchase is the way it works in Minnesota. The red flag law, Minnesota HF 9, is involved if you or someone close to you deems a loved one a danger to themselves or to others. Say I have a brother that I'm really concerned about who's kind of unstable. I can then go to the police, to the sheriff, and say, gosh, my relative is really unstable. I'm concerned about suicide. I'm concerned about homicide. They have a lot of guns, and I just having that access to those guns, it concerns me. And so I would like you to confiscate those guns and evaluate my loved one. So then, county attorney or city attorney can request the protection order, and the police or the sheriff goes to collect the guns. Now, a hearing must occur within 14 days. And during this hearing, psychological evaluation is presented. During that 14 days, the person with the guns, or formerly with the guns, needs to be evaluated by a psychiatrist, some professional like that. and that is presented to the court. And the court then, within 14 days, says, yes, you're fine, or we need to keep your guns. And the person the owner of the guns, can protest and challenge the court ruling, and this decision then is carried out by the judge, by the court, and it can be good for not less than 6 months and not more than 2 years. So there is a limit on there. So one thing I want to mention down here, the gun lobby often says there is no due process. People just get their guns taken away, and they have no chance to challenge that. That is just not true. The court hearing will determine that, and there is due process to evaluate whether this person is a risk to themselves or to others. Now, some people have said, oh, this is just a chance for vengeful girlfriends to get back at their ex-boyfriends. That is not true, because it's a crime to file a false allegation, and people are less likely to file that accusation if they know that it is a crime to do that. Well, I've listed all sorts of issues for us today. I'm focused on the 2 big gun laws. There are a number of other actions we can take. Here's a list of them. I won't go through all of these. You can take a look now. But if our goal and if our mission is to love God and love our neighbors, we can get involved with gun violence prevention. We can do it legally. We can do it while supporting the Second Amendment. We are not about gun control. You've heard that so often. Oh, you're out to take my guns, or you're out to control my guns. That's not true at all. I've got a couple of guns. I already said that. I'm not worried. No one's going to take my guns. That just has not happened. It's not going to happen. But as we talked about with the public health model, we can reduce the number of gun deaths while still allowing people to hunt, to target shoot, to enjoy their firearms in a safe way, in a way that does not lead to death and destruction. Loving God, loving our neighbor, it's core to our mission as followers of Jesus. I think that's enough for one presentation. I hope you'll join me in our effort to reduce gun violence in the world. I do it in honor and in memory of my daughter, Catherine. Studies have shown that the majority of Americans, over 50% of Americans, are touched by gun violence in some way. They know someone who's been shot. They live in a community where people have died or been injured seriously by guns. So it's a plague in our society. I invite you to join me and be a part of that, be a part of the solution. So if you want to get a hold of me, there's my email address. I invite you to contact me. I also invite you to get in contact with momsdemandaction.org, with giffords.org, or within our Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, engageelca.org. And all sorts of resources available online, and please take note of those. Thanks for listening. I hope this has been helpful.